All right, how's this?
Much better. Can everyone see?
Yes.
Okay, it's good.
Okay, excellent. So, anyways, there is a lag time of between 3 to 5 seconds on each slide. So every time I change the slide, I'm going to pause for a little bit just so everyone's caught up. But what you should be looking at is a world map with a bunch of red dots on it. All those red dots are basins where I've actually done work. And then in the US, I've worked about 10 different basins. I've listed all of them on there. So the bottom line is we pretty much work all over the world. In fact, ever since oil prices collapsed, I would say 95% of our work is actually overseas, since all the oil companies in the US are too strapped for cash to bring in consultants. So since starting in 2012, we do have quite a large client base. We started with just 2 oil and gas companies. We're up to over 50 companies at this point. Some of these are companies you're probably familiar with, like we've got BP, Shell, Chevron, EOG Resources, and then there's others you've probably never heard of, like Ophir, like Bellama Oil, and these are local companies. Some of these are in Norway, some of them are in Indonesia. Most of our business actually comes from Norway, Indonesia, and New Zealand. So I've got the folks. You should see a slide right now with my team on there. The team's pretty small, and I've had to remake the team. We used to have a team back in 2012 when I started, and then in 2015 when oil prices crashed, pretty much everyone left except Mr. Angel Mesa. It was just me and him for a while, and then oil prices slowly crept up. They're still not where we want them to be, but we do have a few more people, and these are all technical folks. In fact, Dr. Prerna Singh, she's actually affiliated with the University of Houston as well. So maybe you'll see her on campus sometimes. And besides my own team, we partner with some companies. We partner with iReservoir, which is a geomodeling firm. We partner with Total Depth Geosteering, and then with Terra Chem Labs, and they do all kinds of organic geochemistry. So the way with my consulting firm, the way it works is if someone contacts me and they are wanting a project that involves a little bit of seismic interpretation, a little bit of seismic inversion, and then they want some seismic stratigraphy done, we can handle all of it. So we like to consider ourselves a one-stop shop for pretty much everything that is sedimentology and stratigraphy related with respect to oil and gas. We don't do anything related to the environment. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I do nothing but sedimentology and stratigraphy. Whether I am working on modern carbonates, I do field trips out in Bali, Indonesia. I do field trips on the modern Sapka down in Abu Dhabi. We do ancient classics. So I spend about 100 days in the year out in the field, looking at either modern classics, ancient classics, modern carbonates, ancient classics. And when I'm not out in the field, I'm probably sitting in someone's office or describing core. If I'm sitting in someone's office, it's mainly either seismic interpretation or I'm helping them create better geomodels than what they've got going on already. So the talk we're going to give today is basically a list of top 10 things that I think you should know about sedimentology and stratigraphy and the oil and gas business. And this is not out of a research paper. This is all strictly from my own personal experience. Okay? And so yeah, we'll go through the list. If you've got any questions, you're welcome to stop me right there and then. We've got plenty of time. Or if you just want to wait till the end, you can do that. If you're super shy, you don't have to ask me questions at all. You can email me your questions later on. Whatever floats your boat. So the first thing you should know is that as a fresh graduate, the day you enter an oil and gas company, you already know more about sedimentology and stratigraphy than almost everyone there, depending on the company. Now, there is a very slight possibility that maybe you were recruited straight into Chevron or Exxon's research labs. Yeah, in that case, you're working with the company experts. but that the chances of that happening are slim to none. In most cases, what you will be on is a business unit or an asset team that's working one particular reservoir. So how come you know everyone else when everyone else is so much more experienced? Well, the deal is your boss is probably going to be my age, so I'm in my 40s. Their boss is going to be even older, which means it's been a long, long time since they were in school. Okay. And even when they were in school, the stuff that they were taught is very different than the sort of stuff that you're being taught right now. For example, when I went to school back in the Cretaceous, we learned that shale was pretty much unimportant and it was a pelagic deposit found in quiet water conditions. That's what we were taught about shale. And that was just one line in an entire semester course on sedimentology and stratigraphy. And in this day and age, it's completely opposite. In this day and age, you people would really spend a lot of time talking about shale, and not in the way we used to talk about shale back in the Cretaceous. So it's changed. Same deal with sequence stratigraphy. I remember I literally had to beg the sequence stratigrapher in our department at University of Colorado back in the day, because he would only let grad students into his sequence strat courses. And I literally had to beg him for him to let me in. And even when he did, he made it sound like it was a huge, huge favor that he was doing me. And I was like, all right. So, but in this day and age, I mean, people get sequence strat at the undergrad level. So things have changed quite a bit. So remember, your boss, went to school back in the Cretaceous. Their boss, went to school back in the Precambrian. So things were a lot more different back then. And then what happens is you're going to become like them too, because what's going to happen is you're going to go into an oil and gas company. You arrive at like 8 in the morning. If you are working in operations unit, you're going to be arriving at 7 in the morning, because at 7:30 most companies have a drillers meeting, and they're just going to be for an hour. All you're going to hear is, yeah, so the drill bit got stuck, and they're going to have some lost circulation right there. So we just increased the mud weight up to 4.9, and then Bill called and he said he was late with the Packers, and you're like, God damn, what is mud weight and what's Packers? And what happens is you start learning the business side of it. You learn the terminology that matters to them, and slowly you too get rusty. So after 3 years, you've forgotten most of your sedimentology and stratigraphy, because if you're working in the US especially, there's very little set strat being done. It's a lot of it is operations, and they call them engineering resource plays for a reason. So this is a typical work day. You arrive at 8 to 9 in the morning, you meet and greet, check your emails, then you go into meetings, then you have lunch, then you have more meetings, then you have meetings about meetings, then you have meetings about the meetings you had last week, and then you have meetings about meetings you're going to have next week. And then it's pretty much time to go home. So there's really very little time. So the reason this slide is in here is because what I want you to know is I want you to be confident when you walk in there, because you know more than most other people. So you'll pick up on things that other people won't. A quick example of that is when I interned with Chevron in Houston. This was their South African business unit. They were going to place a $150 million well jacket in offshore West Africa, offshore Angola. And when I looked at their core, I looked at their seismic data, I told them that the place that they had selected to place this well jacket, from where they were going to drill 5 different wells, was not the right place because there was no reservoir there. And they're like, well, wait a minute, how does this kid know this? So then they sent me to San Ramon in California, where their research lab was, and I met with their experts, and they're like, yeah, this kid is right. There is no reservoir where we're going to drill. And so they changed it. They actually changed it all around just because of my recommendation. So the moral of the story is, do not be shy in voicing your opinion when it comes to sedimentology and stratigraphy. Okay? Now we're on to the next slide. No single data set provides all the answers. This is what happens when most people stay in an oil and gas firm for 10 to 20 years. They get pigeonholed. What does that mean? What that means is you come in and they're like, well, you know what, Jen? You're going to be a petrophysicist. And as soon as they say that, what that means is you now have a label. And from here onward, you will only be looking at well logs for as long as you're in that particular company, which means you're not going to get to look at seismic. You're not going to look at core for sure. So now you're just stuck looking at logs. Same deal with someone else. We're like, hey, you know what, Danny, we're going to make you a geophysicist, and you're going to become our AVO expert. And you're like, all right. Now what that means is now they're only going to have you look at seismic data, and you're not going to look at core, and you're not going to look at logs. And what I would recommend for your own professional development is that you become well-rounded, because no single data set can give you an answer. For example, if you showed me this core, and I'm going to zoom in on it, okay, and when I zoom in on it, what you should be able to see are some crossbeds, and on top of each foreset, you see this black line, and what those black lines are, those are mud drapes. And when you have tons of mud drapes like this preserved, it tells you that there's some sort of tidal signature. So we've got dunes that were migrating under the influence of tides. So the question is, well, what is it? Well, if someone could look at this and be like, you know what, I think we're looking at a tidal bar in an estuary. Someone else could look at it and you're like, you know what, I think we're looking at a tidal channel in a tide-dominated delta. Well, which one is it? Well, guess what? By looking at this core, you can't tell. You cannot distinguish between a tidal bar and a tidal channel just by looking at a core if you've got no other data. But let's assume we do have data. We have this well log, and I look at this, and it's showing coarsening going from the bottom towards the top in this gamma ray log. I see coarsening over a scale of about 30 meters or so. And I'm like, well, you know what? Deltas prograde, and because they prograde, they produce a coarsening upward signature. So this supports my interpretation of this being a distributary channel associated with a tide influence delta. And then you look at the seismic, and when you look at the seismic, you can see clinoforms in the seismic, and incised valleys don't make clinoforms. So that is most likely deltaic. It's only when you integrate all three things that you get that answer. If you gave me that seismic line, yeah, I could see the clinoforms and I could tell you that it's most likely a delta, but I can't tell you whether it's a tide-dominated delta, a wave-dominated delta, or a ripper-dominated delta. In order for me to do so, I need to be able to take a look at the logs and the core. So my recommendation to you is the more well-rounded you get, the better off you're going to be. The third thing you should know is that most clastic reservoirs on the shelf are below seismic resolution. What do we mean by that? Well, what that means is, I'm going to go back to that last slide. If I zoom in on this guy right here, each one of these reflections, in most cases in the oil and gas business, represent a thickness of between 30 and 40 meters. That is the thinnest bed, that is the thinnest interval that we can resolve on seismic, is about 30 to 40 meters. All right, so if that's 30 to 40 meters, and we look at a modern depositional system from clastics, there's a delta, you're looking at this mouth bar. This mouth bar is about 5 to 12 meters thick. This distributary channel is 4 to 12 meters thick. We've got some other channels up here, less than 5 meters thick. Out here, I've got a linear wave-dominated coastline. So if you're looking at a shore face, at best, maybe 15 meters thick. So all these sand bodies that we want to drill into are below seismic resolution. So what that means is, if you're sitting on seismic data and you're just spending hours and hours and hours, and you're like, what are you doing? Like, oh, I'm looking for a distributary channel. Well, guess what? You're not going to find one. I've actually had that as a consultant. I've been in companies where I saw this new hire, and on his workstation, you know, he's been at it like all morning. He's looking through the same seismic line. I'm like, what are you looking for, man? He's like, oh, I'm looking for tidal channels. I'm like, all right. I'm like, okay, take a piece of paper, draw a tidal channel on it, and I want you to put it on your workstation. I want you to tell me how big it should be on your seismic line. And when he did so, he drew this huge thing, whereas in fact, he wouldn't have ever been able to see it in cross-sectional view. So again, know what you're looking for, and knowing the scale is super important. And remember, for most clastic shallow marine reservoirs, you're not going to be able to see them on seismic data in cross-sectional view. All right, the next thing you should know is when you are working carbonates. if someone is working carbonates and you want to do anything which is meaningful, which means you want to come up with some sort of facies interpretation, you want to do some sort of sequence stratigraphy, you need to make thin sections, okay? Because if you're not going to make thin sections, you're going to be in a lot of trouble, because I've got different carbonate core here. These are from the Norwegian Barents Sea. This is between Norway and Russia. And they're just, they've discovered a bunch of oil up there. They're drilling a lot of wells. I'm going to zoom in on one of these guys. Okay. Do you guys see any sedimentary structures whatsoever? Let's not be shy. The answer is no. There are no sedimentary structures that are in there. Okay. Yeah, you see some fractures. Okay, so there's plenty of fracturing in there. You do see some textural variations. You can see, okay, this is darker, this is lighter, this is darker again. Maybe there's some sort of cyclicity going on, but you're not seeing cross beds in here. You're not seeing ripples. You're not seeing hummocks and swales. And that's how most carbonates are. When you look at carbonates, I tell people that there'll be times when you are super excited because this is your one day on the job, where someone has invited you to come look at a core, and you walk in there and you're like, oh my God, I'm finally getting to see some core. We've been drilling into the Niobrara for months now. And you go there and you know what it looks like? It looks like concrete. It looks like the sidewalk. There's no structures in it whatsoever. So what are you supposed to describe? Nothing. A lot of times you just can't describe anything because you see nothing in there. So, well, what you should be doing is you should be taking some stickers, putting those on the core where you want thin sections taken. And as soon as you get those thin sections and you look at those underneath the microscope, now you have tons of details. Now, when I look at this thin section, I'm like, oh, that's a bryozoan right there. Okay, that's a pelecypod, which is a fancy term for a bivalve. Okay, I can see those. I can see that there's a lot of green minerals in there. Maybe it's some sort of glauconite or chamosite, but I'm starting to pick up details. Same thing here. I'm like, okay, all those blue empty spots, those are pores, and they're pores where spun spicules used to be. So again, now I can start making some sort of meaningful description and interpretation. But without those thin sections, man, you're stuck. And you'd be amazed at how many people don't know this. In fact, there was a company that contacted me. They're here in Denver, and people in Denver don't really work carbonate that much. So these guys, they contacted me a few years ago, and they're like, hey, can you go to Siberia to go describe some core? I said, all right, yeah, I'll go to Siberia to go describe your core for you. And I'm like, what kind of core is it? And it's like, oh, it's carbonate mud rock core. I'm like, okay, do you have thin sections? They're like, yeah, they have thin sections down in Siberia. I'm like, good. Can I look at those thin sections? Do you have photos of those here? He's like, no, we don't have photos. I'm like, all right. Can I look at those thin sections underneath a microscope in Siberia? And they're like, no, you can't do that. I'm like, okay, can I bring the thin sections back with me and look at the thin sections underneath my own microscope? And they're like, no, you're not allowed to bring data out of Russia. So I'm like, well, man, you know what? In that case, why don't you do this? You go to Walmart, you pick up an $80 slide scanner, you send that up to Siberia, have them scan those thin sections with that slide scanner, and send me the high resolution images. And instead of me charging you $25,000 to go out of Siberia, which is what they were willing to pay me, I'll do the whole thing for you in less than $5,000. And you know what those guys did? They decided to go with someone else because they're like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And that guy, I know him pretty well. He goes down to Siberia and then he brings back core descriptions that are nothing but a straight line with no sedimentary structures in them. So don't be like those guys. Remember that if you're going to do meaningful work in carbonates, you have to have thin sections. That's just how it is. All right, number 5, you will make mistakes. Everyone does, okay? But you can avoid these mistakes by being collaborative. Okay, I'll give you an example from my own work. My own PhD was on the sequence stratigraphy of mixed carbonate clastic evaporite systems. Everything was very, very shallow water. Okay, I did not work on any deep water deposits. Well, after Chevron, my next gig was out in Norway, and I was supposed to describe a bunch of deep water core and then come up with all kinds of company interpretations and figure out where to drill in these deep water channels and lobes. When I looked at my first core, the core had the exact same trace fossils that I'd seen in shallow marine successions. So we're talking about Silonicnus, Colithos, all those trace fossils that I associated with shallow marine environments. So what I was like, well, maybe, you know what? I think what we're looking at are shallow marine deposits. And so I called up one of my colleagues and I'm like, hey man, have you looked at that core? Because they're calling it deep water, but I'm finding a bunch of these shallow marine trace fossils in there. And he was like, no, Ali, we're pretty sure that those are deep water sands. We've got seismic horizon slices where you can see those channels and lobes. And I was like, well, what's going on? Like I interpreted everything as being shallow marine just because of the trace fossils. And then I figured out later on that, you know what? These organisms that burrow and create these burrows, they're substrate dependent, which means Scolithos prefers moving sandy substrates. Now that could be moving sandy substrates on a deltaic mouth bar in a shallow marine setting, or it could be moving sandy substrate on a deep water lobe. So Scolithos really doesn't care whether we're in a shallow marine environment or a deep marine environment. All it cares about is that the sand moves around and it needs to create its burrows in a way where it can stabilize itself. So it was a huge mistake I made. Hopefully, the good thing was it got caught early on, so I didn't go and present in front of the exploration manager with my new interpretation. But it got caught in time, and I was like, well, crap, this is not good. And the company decided to send me to South Africa for 2 weeks of training. And the folks that I went out there with, they knew so much more about deep water systems, and I was just embarrassed the entire time that I was there. I was like, I don't know anything, man. And I promised myself, once I get back to Norway, I'm going to learn as much about this stuff as I can. And I did. I spent 3 years. I was like 2-3 papers a day. Every day, I'm going to take every training course possible until I know what I'm doing with deep water depositional systems. And I kept doing it until the point I got so good at it. One day, Schlumberger Next contacted me randomly, and they're like, hey, we've heard a lot about you. How would you like to teach our deep water reservoirs course? I was like, all right. So everyone makes mistakes, but try to be collaborative. So if it's I get students contacting me all the time who have been with me, they've taken a short course of mine, listened to one of my talks, and now they're going and working for someone. I've had a guy who routinely calls me from Oxy, and he sent me a seismic horizon slice from the Wolf Camp. He's like, hey, I made this seismic horizon slice. This is really funky. What's going on? And I'm like, oh, well, you're looking at a mass transport deposit. So talk to people. You can reach out to your old advisor. You can reach out to your friends that are working in other companies, but do not work in a bubble, because then when you make mistakes, they don't get caught. And that can be really bad. All right, the next one we're going to talk about is that this term formation, these are gross generalization. What does that mean? Well, what that means is, let's assume one of you guys gets a job working for Oxy, and you're super lucky. So they're like, hey, you know what? Not only are you going to work for Oxy, we just bought Anadarko in Denver, so we're going to send you out to Denver. So it's your first day on the job. You've moved out to Denver, and they're like, hey, you know what? You are going to be working on the Frontier Formation on the Wall Creek. You're like, all right, cool. What is it? And you ask Bob, and Bob is like, oh, those are, the Frontier Formation. Yeah, those are these linear, they're linear. And then you're like, okay, I should read a paper on it. And you read a paper by Janet Bhattacharya, and he's like, oh, these are top truncated low stand deltas. You're like, all right, okay. And then you go to a course with the local expert, Gus Gustafson, and he's like, oh no, those are detached shore faces. And you're like, oh, what is going on, man? I mean, are we talking low stand delta? Are we talking detached shore face? Are we talking some linear isolated shelf sand body? What's going on? Well, that's how formations are. Okay, formations are just very gross generalizations. Someone had some idea of what it was, they gave it a name, and now everyone runs with it. So my advice to you is, instead of assuming that, you know what, the frontier or whatever formation you're having to work, like let's talk about the Bone Spring, because chances are you guys are in Houston, you get recruited by someone in Houston, you end up working the Permian Basin. So if someone tells you, yeah, the Bone Spring, yeah, it's this, there are these turbidite sheets on the floor, okay? Now, don't just take their word for it. Do some homework on your own. Go look at some core, and then create your own interpretation. And remember that it's not just one thing. Yes, if the Bone Spring was deposited everywhere from the slope to the basin floor, it's going to have a wide range of facies associations. It may have channels in there. It may have lobes. Some of those lobes may be made up of debrites. Others may be turbidites. Same deal with the channels. Maybe the channels are filled with turbidites. Maybe the channels are filled with mass transport deposits. But it is a collection of facies associations. It is not a single environment of deposition. So what I want you to get out of this one slide is, if someone mentions a formation to you, what you should not assume is that it's a single environment of deposition. So if someone tells you that, oh, the Eagle Ford are shallow marine carbonates that were pelagic. No, the Eagle Ford is a collection of many environments, of which what they've told you is one of many. All right, the next one we're going to talk about is that production must be tied to facies associations if you want to do any sort of meaningful sedimentology and stratigraphy work. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is, when you go to your oil and gas company, it's your first day on the job, it's not going to start with, well, Bill, I want you to go describe a lot of core. No, it's going to be like, hey, I want you to talk to the drillers. This is Mark, he's an engineer, and then this is Jill. Jill is our completions engineer. And then that's Amy, and she's the frac fluids engineer. Well, you're thinking, well, when am I going to make some cool cross sections? Well, you're not going to make any cool cross sections. You're going to stay up all night sitting with the geosteer, drilling some well in some shale somewhere. Okay, so you're like, but I got a PhD. Well, no one told you to get a PhD, right? I'm just messing with you. So, yeah, but bottom line is, don't expect to be doing sedimentology and stratigraphy unless you can justify a reason for doing so. Because these things are time consuming, right? Usually you're using Petra or Petrel and it makes all your cross sections for you. So if you're going to tell your boss that, hey, you know what, I am making a sequence stratigraphic cross section and I'm going to spend the entire day doing so, they're not very happy. They're not happy because there's a million other things you could be doing with your time instead of making that sequence stratigraphic cross section. They want you to do what they think is important. So it is your job to convince them that what you're doing is interesting and it's important. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, the way you do that is you tie production data to facies. This is an example from the Frontier Formation up in the Powder River Basin. And here is the name of the operator. The well names I've hidden because of proprietary reasons. Here's the reservoir facies, and what I've basically done is everything that has tidal influence is in green, everything that has wave influence is in yellow. Okay, and when you go through, you realize that all the best wells are actually always associated with the wave influence stuff. There's a few outliers that may be associated with more tidal influence, but almost everything that's wave dominated is a better reservoir. And that makes sense, right? Because waves are really good at reworking the sediment, the winnow out clays, and you have something that's left behind, which is very well sorted, very clean. Whereas in tidal depositional systems, you've got a lot of mud drapes, and those mud drapes cause permeability anisotropy, which means fluids do not migrate very well vertically or horizontally. So of course you can have better recovery factors and everything flows a lot better in stuff that is wave influenced. Now you could go back and show this to your boss and you're like, hey, you know what? This is the work I've done. I did this on my own time for starters, and I can see some correlations between production and very drilling. And based on what I've done, I think our next well should be in this part of this county. Well, now you're talking, now you're talking their language. You're talking money. And they're like, okay, you know what? maybe I should let this person spend another 2 weeks going to Denver, looking at some core, because what they're doing is actually worthwhile. But if you don't do that, if you're just arm waving and you're like, oh, I should do this because my master's was on the Wolf Camp and I know a lot about it. No, man, you have to convince them. So always tie your production to your facies associations so you can add a little bit of business to it. All right, the next thing you should know is that core is super important and borehole image logs are not a substitute for core. And not a lot of people know about borehole image logs, and the little that they do know about borehole image logs, they mainly use them for fractures. So what's going to happen is, here you are sitting in your office, and then someone comes and grabs you like, hey, Schlumberger's here. They're going to talk about borehole image logs. You're like, all right, well, it's better than me sitting here looking at Excel, so let's go hear this talk. And you go into the meeting room, and there's Schlumberger, and they're like, well, you know what you can see with borehole image logs? You can see crossed beds, which means instead of taking core in your next well, why don't you invite us over, and we'll take a borehole image log instead, and it's going to be 1/4 of the price. And you're like, wow. 1/4 of the price, and I get all the details that I would normally get from core. This is a sweet deal. So we should just go with borehole image logs and not core this stuff at all. That's a bad idea, because that's their business spiel. Okay. If I see crossbeds in a sandstone, what environmental deposition can it be? Well, I can think of about 15 different ones. They're not diagnostic. Okay, it's like cross beds are everywhere. All you need is water moving at about 50, 60 centimeters per second, and you need to find a medium sand, or you're going to make cross beds. Whether that's in a deep water channel, in a fluvial channel, distributary channel, shore face, Aeolian deposit, whatever. Okay, so cross beds are not diagnostic, and borehole image logs are never as good as core. Here is a core from the North Sea, and here is a borehole image log from the same facies. And this is, you guys don't know this, but when I was a kid and you turned on TV and you ran out of channels, this is what the TV screen would look like. Okay? But this looks, so there's no details, there's no sedimentological details that you can pick up in this stuff, whereas you can get tons and tons of details from the core. And you can never get grain sizes from borehole image logs. So don't let anyone convince you that borehole image logs are a substitute for core, because they're not. All right, moving on. Whenever you are working at a depositional system, whatever it happens to be, you should always look for 3 different kinds of analogs. The first analog you should be looking for are modern analogs. So let's assume one of you guys goes to work for Hillcorp, and they are having you work the San Juan Basin in New Mexico. And when you're working the San Juan Basin, let's assume you are working on the Gallup, or what they call the Mancos, which is distal Gallup. So that's what you're working in, it's deltaic. So what's relevant? Modern deltas are relevant. So it is one of the field trips we do. This is people on the Indus Delta in Pakistan. One of the things I do is I take people out into this distributary channel, because when they start walking, they're like, hey, you know, we can't swim, right? I'm like, yeah, that's totally cool. Because they see the channel and they assume it's going to be hundreds of feet deep. And they're like, no, it's not going to be hundreds of feet deep. So I take them all the way to the thalweg of the channel, and they're standing in there, and the water doesn't even get up to their waist. And they're like, wow, these things are super shallow. Yeah, they're super shallow, which means they're so shallow you're not even going to pick it up on seismic. The second thing we do is we take a shovel, and I take a scoop of the bed of the channel, I bring it up, and people think channel, they're like, oh, it's a channel, it's going to be filled with sand. And we bring it up, and it's all mud. And they're like, well, wait a minute. I thought we drill in channels because channels are supposed to be sand rich. Like, not in tide influence deltas, man. This is a turbidity maximum zone. We've got fresh water coming in from land, mixing in with tidal currents, clays flocculate to cover everything up with mud. So this is a channel that's filled with mud. Well, you're not going to get that if you never go to a modern depositional system. So it's very important to look at modern analogs. Even if you don't go there physically, you can read about them. Then it's very important to look at ancient analogs. we in the US are particularly blessed in the sense that pretty much everything we drill, as long as it's not in the Gulf of Mexico, is actually exposed, which means if you're drilling the Wolfcamp, well, you can go to the outcrops of the Wolfcamp. You're drilling the Bone Spring, you can go to outcrops of the Bone Spring. You're drilling any of the sandstones in Rocky Mountain basins, everywhere from Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico. Well, you can go look at their outcrops, and I would strongly urge you to do that. Again, if you can't go there yourself, there are papers that have been published about it. Make sure you read the papers about the ancient analogs. So we've covered the modern, we've covered the ancient. The next one is a subsurface analog. When people first found oil in the Niobrara Formation up in Denver, they got super excited. They're like, oh my God, we find oil and chalk. Woo-hoo-hoo, big deal. We were so smart. We're like, yeah, but the Norwegians found oil and chalk back in the 1970s. And they've been drilling chalk wells, fractured chalk wells in the North Sea for 30 some years now. And when you do that for that long, you learn a thing or two. So instead of you experimenting over here in isolation, why don't you take some time to figure out what the chalk plays in Norway are like and what actually makes them work. And people do this all the time. You know, our egos get in the way. There's folks in the Norwegian Barents Sea. They found some carbonates of Permian age, and they started drilling those and are like, oh my God, we found oil, and they're in carbonate mounds, and they're phyllioid algal. You're like, yeah, the Texans have been doing this for the past 70 some years now, man. So always get out of your bubble. You know, chances are it's already been done. So if you go look at someone's case studies for their subsurface analogs, there are a lot of different things you can learn. So what you see on the slide, this is Tengiz Field in Kazakhstan. It's a huge phyllioid algal mound. Okay, the different colors you see are porosities. Here's another large phyllioid algal mound. This is from the Permian Basin in Texas. And then here's a phyllioid algal mound from the Norwegian Barents Sea. So all those three places are producing from phyllioid algal mounds. So if you're working on it in any one of those, it would be worthwhile to look at the other two to see, well, which places produce the best. Should we be drilling wells in the mound interior? Should we be drilling wells on the flank? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? So it's best to learn from other people's mistakes instead of learning from your own. All right, the last one I think is most important. This is actually a real job ad that was posted online. Okay, it said the job location is in Dallas, and this is what the employer wants you to have. They want you to have a minimum of 2 to 5 years of experience. They want you to know Petra and ArcGIS. They want you to be good at petrography, stratigraphy, sedimentology, geophysical data. They want you to be proficient at these software packages about well data like drilling info, IHS, HPDI. Well, you know what, man? I've got 20 years of experience of this entire list. This is the only one I'm good at. Okay, the stratigraphy and sedimentology part. And that's it. And I don't know of anyone who can do all of these well. So if no one I know, and most people I know are a lot older than you are, and they've been in the oil and gas patch for a lot longer, if none of them can do this, how do they expect someone with 2 to 5 years of experience to be able to do all that? It's not possible, okay? But that's what they want. So how do you make it happen? Well, the way you make it happen is you have to make it happen. You know, right out of college, I was recruited by Chevron, and one of their sales pitches was, well, Ollie, we have the Horizons program, and our Horizons program is the best program in the world, okay? If we are going to train you to be one of the best possible geoscientists you can ever be. I'm like, wow, that sounds amazing. And then you go in, and every time I talk to them about training, they're like, yeah, we need you to focus on drilling some wells right now. And so for the year that I was with them, I never saw what the Horizon program was like. I got maybe one course, and that was it. Okay, technically I was supposed to get between 5 and 10, but I got just one. So the thing is, your employer is looking out for their business. They're not looking out for you. So you have to be the one in charge of your own professional development, because, you know, this industry is cyclic. I got hired when oil prices were super high, and companies were giving, oil and gas companies, I kid you not, were giving offers to non-geologists for geology positions. They're like, hey, come in, we'll teach you everything you need to know. And now smart grad students are graduating and they're not getting jobs, or they turned up for an internship. People turned up for Apache a few years ago. That was like 2 years ago. And when all the interns turned up, they're like, yeah, there's 27 of you. You've got one full-time offer. Good luck. So what's going to happen is when you do get hired, there's layoffs. They'll lay you off. You got 20 minutes to clear your desk. Now what? Well, you're like, well, the company had me take one training course in the 3 years that I was there. And that's the only thing you learned in the past 3 years besides what you learned on the job. And now you start applying elsewhere and they look at your resume and they're like, all right, you really don't know much, do you? So your training, your professional development is your responsibility. It's no one else's. And there's a lot of different opportunities for you to do so. Okay, the best one is local geological society. Houston Geological Society has talks all the time. I would strongly recommend that you go and attend those talks, not just for the learning, but for the networking as well. There's PTTC. These guys offer super cheap courses, and then on top of the super cheap course, it's 50% off for students. And their courses are about everything from fracking to ichnology. So I teach a bunch of their courses. I've taken a bunch of their courses. I would highly recommend looking up PTTC courses. We have a Facebook page. If you're interested in sedimentology, I post stuff on there every day with the description. I've got some very, very brilliant people on there. And so then there's Knowledge At. It's a $250 subscription and tons of little video clips about every topic which is oil and gas related. There's blogs, there's different groups on LinkedIn you can learn from. There's the SCPM Strata website. There's tons of places, but remember, your professional development is your responsibility and no one else's. And those were the top 10 things that I think you should know based on my personal experience. And I hope that was useful for you guys.
All right, definitely. Does anyone have any questions at all?
I'll do one. I don't know if you can hear me now.
I'll tell you a question if you can.
I'm not perfect at seismic interpretation. Where do I begin, I guess, getting exposed to that? Would that be more like short courses and just reading papers and whatnot?
Yeah, what I would recommend is every year at APG, they have like an intro to seismic interpretation course. Every year, when there's an SEG meeting anywhere, they'll most likely have an introduction to seismic interpretation course there as well. And again, anytime you see a conference course, it's already subsidized. So this is, normally people would be paying $4,500 for this course. If they're teaching it at an APG meeting or an SEG meeting, they'll probably teach it for like $500. And then as a student, you'll get a 50% discount on that. So I would look out for SEG and APG courses that are combined with their conferences.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Else?
Yeah. Would you recommend me trying to find a internship before committing to grad school if I don't know what my focus is going to be?
Yeah, if you can get an internship without a master's, while you're not enrolled in a master's, then yes, I would strongly recommend you do so. It would be a little bit more challenging to get an internship if you're not already enrolled in a master's program. But what I would recommend is, you're welcome to send me a LinkedIn message or an email, and I can go over what's actually in demand right now, because what I hate to see is a lot of times, because I don't mean to put down professors, but professors in most cases are highly selfish individuals, in the sense that I am interested in glacial deposits in the Himalayas just because I like mountains and I live in Houston and there are no mountains in Houston, so I'm going to research glaciers so I can get NSF money to go to Nepal. And now I'm looking for students, so I'm somehow going to convince you, oh my God, totally, you know what? We should go to Nepal. Oh, you would love it in Nepal. Well, great. You go to Nepal, you work on isotopes and glaciers for 2 years, and then you're sitting there in an interview with Exxon, and they're like, oh, so what was your master's about? Well, I looked at glaciers in Nepal, and then every other kid has done seismic interpretation on the Bone Spring. There's another kid who's done bell lock correlation for the Eagle Ford. Well, who are they going to go with?
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, so there are topics that are highly relevant to what the oil and gas industry is doing right now. If you're interested, just shoot me an email or a LinkedIn message, and I'd be happy to send you a list.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, anyone else?
I know you showed us the continental basins. Do you do a lot of offshore related?
I do, yes, I do. Most of the stuff I've done is offshore North Sea, Norwegian Sea, Barents Sea. I've done a little bit of stuff offshore West Africa, East Africa. I've done stuff offshore New Zealand.
That's cool.
Are you hiring?
I wish. No, and I get this from a lot of students. They're like, hey, I'm finishing up, is your consulting firm hiring? I would never recommend that you start at a consulting firm. I would recommend that you start with as big of a company as possible. So if possible, go with one of the big five like Exxon, Chevron, Shell, BP, ConocoPhillips. If you can get into one of those, go for the second biggest ones, like companies like Oxy, like EOG Resources, Apache, just so you can get exposed to a lot of different things. You can have multiple assignments, all of which are very different from one another. And once you have that experience, after 10 years, you've made enough connections, then you should think about going and working for a consulting firm.
Is there any way we can get a copy of this presentation as well?
Yeah, of course. What I can do is if you email me, I'll send you a PDF.
Fantastic.
All right, anyone, any more questions? Going once, going twice? Okay, well, that's it for the questions. I will certainly send everyone here your email address if they have any questions that they have for you. But anyway, Ali, thank you very much for
Appreciate it.
yeah, taking the time out of your day. I'm sure you're very busy. We do appreciate it.
Yeah,
No,
thank
you guys are very welcome, and yeah, just keep in touch. Keep in touch, and good luck to you guys.
Thanks.
All right, have a good day. Take care.